Hello, friends, and welcome back to episode 3 of Scattered Thoughts, a mini-cast where we talk about whatever in the world of Magic the Gathering we feel like talking about. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be your host for Scattered Thoughts, and today we are taking a step back to 2018 and talking about the, original Dominaria Limited set. I figured since Dominaria United is in full spoiler season right now, and there's a lot of cool things that are harkening back to Dominaria as a whole, we could step back to 2018 and the set that a lot of people claim to be their favorite set or one of the best limited formats, one of the most balanced formats, so on and so forth. I don't know too many people who say that Dominaria 2018 is their favorite set, but it often comes in at people's top fives and is often quoted as one of the better limited environments. And today we're going to explore some of the things that Dominaria did, some of the things they introduced, and maybe take a step back and see if it still holds up as one of the best limited formats. Now, to put this into perspective from where I stand with the set, myself and my Jink Diver Gaming co-host and co-creator partner Christopher Sofsky, we often quoted Dominaria, the 2018 set, as one of the best sets and one of the motivations behind building the cubes that we build. Dominaria made a reappearance on Arena a little while ago as a rotating draft format, and having played it a little bit, Chris played it a little bit, we came to kind of a consensus that some of the things haven't really held up that we thought made the format great, and we're going to explore that today. I do want to do kind of a half and half focus on the impact and the legacy of Dominaria 2018, as well as the limited format, what made it great and what hasn't held up. So that's what's on the docket today. Now, let's kick things off by putting a little bit of perspective on the set for people who may not have been there to draft it or are newer players or have just never interacted with that Dominaria set. It was released in April 2018. It did a lot of firsts for Magic, which we'll get into, but it's worth noting that Dominaria as a setting was not new to the set. Dominaria is basically the world that Magic took place on for the first 15 years or something like that. Pretty much all of the beginning sets, the first 10, 20 sets, all took place on Dominaria. I can't actually tell you off the top of my head which was the first set to deviate from that, but Dominaria is kind of the core of Magic. So whenever you go back to Dominaria, which we're doing right now, you are exploring so many different worlds, so many different creature types, and so many historical stories and things like that. Things that I wasn't even around for as a Magic player. So there's a lot to pull from. There's a lot of expectations. 2018 was the first time going back to Dominaria in God knows how long, which means they wanted to focus on kind of the history of the setting. So Dominaria, the 2018 set, was billed as kind of the historical set or the legend-based set. And there's a lot of history and legendary stuff scattered throughout. Notably, Richard Garfield took place in the actual set design, which is kind of cool. Original OG Richard Garfield had a touch on this, and it kind of shows there's a lot of simplistic stuff going on in the format that you would expect from, the person who created Magic the Gathering. Literally as Garfield intended. That is what you're getting out of this set. And I would add to that and just say that this is a simpler set. There are some complicated things going on, but the mechanics are pretty easy to understand. This is before modern day fire design, if that's still going on, where, they want every single card to appeal to someone. There's a lot of stinkers in here, which we'll talk about. There are commons that basically have no home inside or outside of Limited, but I don't think that really dissuades people that much from calling this one of their favorite sets. Now, first things first, we should probably look at the landscape of the format, kind of what shaped the limited format, and we can look at some of the mechanics of the set. This was the first time where there were uncommon legends scattered throughout the set. We had gotten this before. We've seen uncommon legends prior to this. I think the Kamigawa block, Betrayers, and Champions, and so on. I think that was the first time we saw uncommon legends, period, but Dominaria was the first time that it became vogue to do that, and you'll see it from Dominaria forward to modern day. We just get uncommon legends in every single set now. Part of that is due to Commander, part of that is due to Dominaria being the quote-unquote historical set where, legends actually took place and stuff like that, but there is a legend in every single pack, and they do kind of warp the format around them. One of the headlining new mechanics for the set, and it's less of a mechanic and more of a descriptor, is quote-unquote historic. The term historic refers to anything that's legendary, anything that's an artifact, or anything that's a saga, which we'll get to in a minute, and it kind of shaped things around it. That means that you can basically make an artifact-heavy set, but you also get to tie in these legendary archetypes into it. We have not seen historic reused since then, but it is a nice way to tie together multiple different themes and kind of encompass them into one thing. We saw this as well in Neo Kamigawa with Modified, which tied together artifacts, auras, and counters, which are wildly different things for different decks, but you can kind of encompass them into one thing and make these unique builds for Commander and Constructed and stuff like that. That's kind of what historic was doing here. We just mentioned sagas, and if you're a modern Magic player, you're probably familiar with sagas. They get used like every other set now, but that's because they're awesome, and Dominaria was the first time sagas were introduced. They kind of hit it out of the park with sagas the first time. Nothing in Dominaria is super overpowered or crazy or anything like that, but you can see the influence of sagas moving forward in Magic, because it gets used so often. I mean, we've had probably 5 or 6 sets now that include sagas with a little bit of a tweak to the formula. I know Theros Beyond Death had them, Kaldheim had them. Recently, Neo Kamigawa had the sagas that flip into enchantment creatures, and now in Dominaria United, we're getting the new sagas that have the read ahead mechanic, which lets you choose which chapter that they start on, which is a really cool twist. Basically, it's an awesome type of permanent that people love to play with. It's really fun. It's got to be really fun and difficult for the designers to make these sagas and make all the different chapters relevant, not make them overpowered or underpowered. It's just really cool, and I expect that we're going to see more sagas moving forward, and we're going to see definitely a bunch of different twists on them, which we're starting to see in modern day Magic. The only other real new mechanic from Dominaria was the introduction of legendary sorceries. These were sorceries with powerful effects, but you could only cast them if you had a planeswalker, a legendary planeswalker, or a legendary creature on board. So it was kind of supposed to mimic the idea of this big legendary person casting this huge spell. They were a little bit of a miss for Limited. I do believe some of them got played and constructed. I know Karn's Temporal Sundering got played and constructed. Some of them are actually pretty good in Commander. Jaya's Immolated Inferno is perfectly fine. Urza's Ruinous Blast sees a lot of play. Karn's Temporal Sundering is good there. Yawgmoth's Vile Offering. And then, yeah, Kamal's Druidic Vow, Primeval's Glorious Rebirth. It turns out they're actually all kind of good for Commander, but you have so many more legendaries floating around there. For Limited, you would often walk away with a deck that had 3, 4, 5 legends, and you would often get in these positions where you didn't have a legendary creature on board, you almost never had a planeswalker, and you just couldn't cast these spells. So a lot of people considered them a trap. I think they were more of build-around territory than a straight-up trap, but they were a little bit difficult to pull off, and a lot of times you would get stranded with these cards in your hand. So it's not really surprising that we haven't seen these again, but I wouldn't be surprised if we do. It's a cool concept of this big character in Magic casting this huge flashy spell. It is just a little bit difficult to actually pull it off consistently. Moving away from new mechanics, we saw Kicker make a return here. We're actually seeing Kicker again in the current Dominaria United set, although that has a twist of having multiple Kicker abilities on the same creature. This was just generic, straight-up Kicker. Pay some extra mana, make your creature or your spell a little bit better. There was like a 2-mana instant that gave +2/+2, and you could pay a Kicker cost of 2 to make it +4/+4 instead. Or there was Academy Drake as just a bread and butter Wind Drake, a 3-mana 2/2 flyer, and you could pay 4 extra colorless mana to make it come down as a 4/4 flyer. There was a lot of generically good stuff like that. A lot of really cool Kicker abilities as well. The one that comes to mind is Josu Vess, which was a 4-mana 4/5 menace, but if you kicked it for, I believe, 6 mana, you made an army of 2/2 menaces. It came with 8 2/2 menaces on ETB, so 10 mana nets you a 4/5 menace and 8 2/2 menaces. Just a super sweet thing to pull off. Also, Fight with Fire, which was 3 mana sorcery to deal 5 damage to a creature, but if you kicked it for an additional 6 mana, you got to deal 10 damage, split up however you wanted. Just a really splashy, cool Kicker effects, but also very, very simple. Dominaria was also the first time that we saw the hexproof from text, which doesn't get used very often, but it was introduced here as an alternative to just natural hexproof or protection from colors. I believe it was only used on the 2 cards in the set, the Knight of Glory and the Knight of Malice, but hexproof from just meant that whatever it was hexproof from, you couldn't be targeted by those things, but you could still be targeted by other things. It was kind of a workaround to making the creature just universally annoying and just making it annoying against certain types of cards or certain colors. So, for instance, Knight of Glory had hexproof from black, which meant black stuff couldn't interact with it very easily, but all the red, green, white stuff could still target it and block it and all that good stuff. It is a little bit weird that they introduced this here as an alternative to hexproof, but there were also hexproof cards in the set, like Coldwater Snapper, but it was a nice alternative. We have Ward now. We still see hexproof from every now and then. For instance, the Alchemy Baldur's Gate set has Jaheira, which has hexproof from artifacts and enchantments for some reason, but it is another tool in their belt to give creatures targeted protection from certain types of abilities. And obviously, Knight of Malice and Knight of Glory were supposed to be like a flashback to White Knight and Black Knight and, the multiple iterations that those cards have had. Another very minor thing here, Dominaria introduced the first equip ability that could equip a specific type of thing. I want to say that Blackblade Reforged was the only card in the set that did it. Blackblade Reforged, for those who don't know, is a 2-mana equipment that can equip to a creature for 7 mana, but it also says equip a legendary creature for 3 mana, I believe. So there was an alternative way to equip it to a specific subset of cards. That doesn't get used very often. I can't actually even think of an example off the top of my head that's used that sense, but it was introduced here in Dominaria. And moving away from the mechanics, we've got a couple firsts that Dominaria introduced to Magic, or rather, these are things that can be attributed to Dominaria and the legacy of the set moving forward, and how it's influenced modern design, how it's influenced limited design, so on and so forth. I think the biggest thing is that Dominaria was the first set that introduced the concept of only having big sets in Magic. Before Dominaria, most limited sets were broken up into blocks. Those blocks would consist of usually a large set and then a smaller set that was released 3 months later, 2 months later, something like that, and they were meant to be drafted together. So, for example, if you weren't around for Ixalan, the way it worked is Ixalan came out sometime in 2017, and then 3 months, 4 months down the line, Rivals of Ixalan came out as a smaller set that was meant to be drafted alongside original Ixalan, and you would draft those sets together. So you would sit down, you would open a pack of Rivals of Ixalan, you would draft that pack, you would open another pack of Rivals, and then your third pack would actually be original Ixalan. And moving back even further, before they did 2 set blocks, there were 3 set blocks, which is where I was introduced to Magic and what they did for a very, very long time. So you have sets like Theros, original Theros from 2012, where you drafted a pack of Theros, you drafted a pack of Born of the Gods, and you drafted a pack of Journey into Nyx, with those second 2 sets being smaller sets that were meant to complement the main set. It got a little bit messy. Almost never, or rather always, the second and third set in a block were just toned down, weaker versions of the first set that made the limited format a little less exciting, a little less consistent. So it made sense to move towards this all big sets, and that's what we do ever since Dominaria. Dominaria was the first one to do this. So if there's a set that follows Dominaria, it's meant to be its own standalone draft format. So you get to planes like Ravnica. We've had a whole Ravnica block since Dominaria came out. Ravnica Allegiance, Guilds of Ravnica, and War of the Spark. Those were all designed individually as their own set. There are some cool things you can do, like combining them together. We saw this with Double Feature and Midnight Hunt, Crimson Vow, where they just combined the sets together. That was kind of a lazy way to go about it, but you could have seen how they could have combined those 2 sets into their own curated draft format. There's nothing stopping them from doing that, but every set from Dominaria forward has been designed as its own individual experience, and that has been a net positive for Limited as a whole. We've already mentioned the introduction of uncommon legendaries as kind of a vogue thing to do in Limited Magic, and that's been used ever since. When you get to top-down design sets that are based off of certain mythologies, you're just going to see tons of legends, and they fit a lot of those in the uncommon slot. So think Theros Beyond Death, which had a whole cycle of demigods and other gold uncommon legends. Think Kaldheim, which had a bunch of uncommon legends. We just see these moving forward now. I think the prevalence of Commander and the way that legends kind of play in Limited and let you pump the power of certain cards means that people just kind of like seeing them. And sometimes it feels like it's a little overboard, but we just get legends in every single set now, and we get tons of them. So there's no real stopping on that. That's just kind of something that's happening. But it was kind of a fresh thing when Dominaria came out. As far as rules go, Dominaria abolished the Planeswalker redirection rule, which I wouldn't even fault you if you didn't know that was a thing. So prior to Dominaria, what you would do is if you had a burn spell like a Lightning Strike or a Lightning Bolt and you wanted to deal 3 damage to a Planeswalker, what you had to do was deal 3 damage to your opponent. And then because of the Planeswalker redirection rule, you could just say that you're going to redirect that damage to a Planeswalker instead. It was this really roundabout, messy way of dealing damage directly to Planeswalkers, and there were also some weird rules implications, like if I had Hexproof, if I gave me, the player, Hexproof with something like Shalai or Leyline of Sanctity, my opponent couldn't target me with a burn spell, and therefore couldn't redirect it to a Planeswalker. They changed this with a huge Oracle overhaul of the text on cards, so that damage dealt to anything could just said, deals damage to any target. So Lightning Strike, instead of saying deals 3 damage to a creature or player, it just says any target, which means it can hit Planeswalkers as well. A lot of cards got this overhaul, and now the burn spells are just very specific about what they can target. If they say target any target, they can hit players, creatures, or Planeswalkers, but if they say hit a creature or Planeswalker, they can't go to face. They're very specific about what they can target now, and that Planeswalker redirection rule no longer exists. Dominaria also saw the removal of the term mana pool from cards. So if you look at a Llanowar Elves from early 1900s and you look at a Llanowar Elves from 2018 Dominaria, they read differently. The original one says add green to your mana pool. The newer Dominaria version says add green. I think they just use that to clear up text, make it more concise. Nobody really knows what a mana pool is anyway, and that's not something that really gets taught to new players. So it's a small change that made things a little bit less wordy to understand. Overall, a positive change that really doesn't actually change that much. And then finally, the set had a couple small nuances with the way that they worded things. For instance, they took away gender-specific terms like he, she, and just replaced them with they or them on cards, which, is overall net positive for people who are playing the game. They had cards refer to themselves whenever they were on the stack, which is a very minor thing that nobody would even catch anyway, but does clear up a little bit of confusion with some of the cards. So yeah, overall, Dominaria introduced a lot of really small things. I think the biggest thing is the only large sets moving forward, and that's not specific to Dominaria. It was just the kind of the set at the forefront of doing that, and it stands out because of that. The uncommon legends, the sagas, these are some of the biggest things that were being contributed to Magic moving forward, especially for limited design. So speaking of limited, let's take a little bit to just kind of talk about what the limited format looked like, why people like it, what maybe misses nowadays if you went back and played it compared to some of the more pumped up sets today. It is worth noting that modern Magic sets, maybe for the last 3 or 4 years, have been quite powerful, especially in the common and uncommon slots. You'll notice that vanilla creatures don't really get printed anymore, whereas vanillas were very prevalent in almost every Magic set prior to that. There's a lot of stuff going on in Dominaria that looks weak by comparison, but it is its own self-contained thing. So first things first, Dominaria is a very uncommon-centric set. The commons are overall fairly weak, and the rares are not super bomby outside of a couple exceptions, which means that your uncommon legends, your uncommon sagas, these are the cards that really grinded through the game and gave you the value and interacted with your opponent the best. When you think back to Dominaria, often you're going to think back to certain engine pieces that kind of ruled the games. A lot of people considered these little mini-game cards where if your opponent couldn't deal with them, they were going to fall behind over the course of a couple turns. But the game wasn't immediately over. There were not that many cards that just ended the game on the spot. So in this category, I'm talking about cards like Tatiova, Benthic Druid, and Slimefoot the Stowaway, right? Tatiova was this 5-mana 3/3 that had a landfall ability that gained a life and drew a card whenever a land entered the battlefield. 5-mana 3/3, pretty weak, easy to deal with a lot of the removal, but that ability will outgrind you if you can't deal with it. Slimefoot was very similar. Slimefoot's a 3-mana 2/3 that you can pay 4 mana to spit out a 1/1 Saproling, and whenever a Saproling died, you drained your opponent for a life. So again, an engine that lets you pump out tokens, but costs 4 mana, right? It's pretty expensive to do it. Once you get into the late game, it can start taking over. It helps grind the game out with some life gain, deals some incidental damage. It was a really good card. Slimefoot and Tatiova were basically gold cards that you wanted in your deck no matter what. You would splash for them, so on and so forth. And they were quite powerful, and that's around the power level of what you were looking at for the set. A lot of these uncommons dominated the games if left unchecked, but didn't just end the games on the spot. By comparison, the commons just weren't really that good. There's a lot of synergy-based common stuff going on in the set, but not a lot of raw power, not a lot of 2-for-1s, things like that. Just creatures with power and toughness and maybe a keyword. This was kind of the close-in era of this like 5, 6, 7 year stretch where Wizards was intentionally making removal a little bit worse for limited. Dominaria is kind of in the middle of that shift back towards good removal, but we're talking about cards like Eviscerate, which is a 4-mana sorcery that destroys a creature, Blessed Light, which was a 5-mana instant that I think exiled a creature or an enchantment. These were kind of your best removal spells at common. Very clunky. They did deal with the things you needed to deal with, but they stacked up so well against the threats. Maybe not the sagas, but cards like Tatiova, this 5-mana engine piece, they did die to your 4 and 5 mana removal. Often you got value off of them, but you were able to deal with them, and they cleanly dealt with a lot of the bombs in the format. Speaking of which, this is actually one of the least bomby sets that I can remember in recent history. There were certainly bombs. There were cards like 5-mana Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, which you probably know. There was Multani, which was a 6-mana Trampler. I believe it had Reach as well. I might be making that part up. But it had power and toughness equal to the number of lands you controlled, and it had an ability to bring itself back from the yard if it died. So if you didn't exile it, it was just going to dominate the game. There was also Demon Lord Belzenlock, which big 6/6 Flampler, flying and trample for 6 mana. Had a card draw ability attached to it. Just could close out the game very quickly. These are all things that died to most of the removal spells in the format. Although Multani could always come back from the graveyard, Teferi was a planeswalker. Outside of these top 3, most of the rares were just on the same power level as the uncommons. Usually big splashy creatures and effects and stuff like that. Nothing too game warping, especially when you compare it to a bomby format like Crimson Vow or Rivals of Ixalan or Baldur's Gate, the Alchemy version. For the most part, things were fairly even across the uncommons and rares, although the commons lag behind quite a bit. Like I said, nowadays they design cards with this quote-unquote fire design philosophy where they want everything to be playable, they want everything to feel like you're doing something when you cast it. Dominaria still had a lot of these vanillas and just kind of objectively poor statted creatures. You would have, for instance, your 2-mana 2/2 vanilla in black. There was a card called Pardic Wanderer, which is 6 colorless mana for a 5/5 trampler, and you would put that in your deck very often just because it was a historic creature and it dealt some damage. You did have a lot of cool grindy creatures with Kicker. The Kicker cards meant that you always had action early in the game if you needed it, but you also scaled into the late game quite well with cards like Gitu. I can't remember the name of the card, but it's a 2-mana 1/3. You could kick it for 4 mana to get a spell back from your graveyard. There was Caligo Skin, which comes to mind as another 2-mana 1/3. You could kick it for 4 mana to make your opponent discard 2 cards. Basically, 2 drops that could block an attack if need be, as well as 6 drops that had a more meaningful impact on the game. So I think if there is a huge knock against Dominaria and the thing that turns people off, it's probably the power level of the commons. A lot of it just doesn't stack up well against what people are doing these days. I imagine if you took your best limited Dominaria deck and you matched it up against a limited deck of average quality from a more recent set, you're going to have a pretty tough time winning with the Dominaria deck. You're just going to be outclassed by the power level of commons and uncommons and removal that we see in modern day Magic. And this is a very self-contained thing, and it's something I don't knock the format for very much. It is weak by comparison to other sets, but as its own self-contained limited format, it kind of matches up well. The commons don't compete with the uncommons particularly well, but the rares don't necessarily outshine anything, which means that if you have a few uncommons and a couple value engines of your own in your deck, you can kind of put together these Rube Goldberg machines of value and stuff like that. There wasn't really a super aggressive deck in the format. There were a lot of bad 2-drops. That's another knock against this set, is A lot of the 2-drops were pretty bad, so aggro was pretty bad, but that does lead to a more grindy interactive format, and I think that's what a lot of people like about this set. A couple other features of this set I wanted to go over. There were some tribal mechanics. Wizards and Saprolings featured very heavily as 2 of the gold pairs. There was blue-red wizards. There was black-green Saprolings with a lot of payoffs. There were a few Goblin things that was mostly like a swing and a miss. Goblin War Chief was here. There's Skirk Prospector. There's probably 1 or 2 other Goblin cards I'm not even thinking about. But it was really just a bad deck for Limited and mostly just a plant for Constructed. There were also a few Knight tribal cards, but I think there were only just a couple, and they were mostly rares like Ariel and History of Benalia. There was a cycle of triple colored rares that were actually quite good. If you could pull them off and gave you a real incentive to draft a monocolored deck, they all saw constructed play at one time or another. I'm talking things like Goblin Chain Whirler, Steel Leaf Champion, Tempest Djinn. These were really cool cards to build around, but were also very hard to make work. Overall, these were mostly plants for constructed that occasionally would sneak your way into your limited deck and would make you feel rewarded for drafting towards that color or preferencing toward that color. I thought they were pretty good, tame additions to the card pool. There are also the check lands, which includes like Isolated Chapel and Clifftop Retreat, basically the lands that come in untapped if you control a basic of either of the other colors. I want to say that this cycle was the second half of the cycle from Ixalan or Rivals of Ixalan, so Drowned Catacomb, Dragon Skull Summit. Those were in a different set, and then these ones are the are they allied or enemy color? I always forget, but red, white, black, white, so on and so forth. We saw those check lands reprinted here as well. And then also one of the biggest features of the set, one of the things people are going to look back on and remember, is that you could get in these really grindy, loopy games where you could put together this unstoppable engine that didn't necessarily just end the game on the spot, but outvalued your opponent super, super hard. So for example, if you think about the interaction between Garna the Bloodflame and Whisper Blood Liturgist, Garna was this 5-mana flash creature. It gave all of your creatures haste, and when it entered the battlefield, you returned every creature that was put into your graveyard that turn back to your hand. You combine that with Whisper, which was a 4-mana 2/2 with a tap ability that lets you sack 2 creatures to reanimate something, and you could get in these sweet loops where you tap Whisper, you sacrifice Whisper plus another creature, you reanimate Garna, and when Garna comes into play, you get to return Whisper and the other reanimated creature back to your hand. And then obviously you could play Whisper again. Whisper would have haste because of Garna's ability. You could tap her to sacrifice Garna and Whisper to reanimate something else. And then if you could get Garna back down the line, you could keep rinsing and repeating. There were a couple ways to return creatures back from your graveyard to your hand, like Soul Salvage, which is, by modern days, just kind of a mediocre card. It's 3-mana sorcery that returns 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand. That let you loop some of the powerful kicker cards and some of the engine pieces like Garna and Whisper, and you could put together decks that just could be picked apart, but could rebuild and get their engine back going very easily. Just as another example, there was an interaction between Rona, Disciple of Gix, and Time of Ice. Rona is a 3-mana 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you can exile a historic permanent from your graveyard, and then you can play that as long as it's exiled, as long as Rona's on the battlefield. The card that you wanted to get back was Time of Ice. Time of Ice is a 4-mana saga, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to trigger Chapter 1. Chapter 1 and 2 both tap down a creature and keep them frozen until Time of Ice leaves the battlefield, and then the final chapter would return all tapped creatures to their owner's hands. So a lot of times with Time of Ice, you would just tap down an opponent's creature. On Chapter 2, you would tap down another creature, and then Chapter 3 would bounce those creatures back to your opponent's hand. Basically a huge tempo swing. But with Rona, you could tap down one of your opponent's creatures, tap down another one of your opponent's creatures, and then once Chapter 3 goes on the stack, you could activate Rona, which she had a tap ability that let you basically play the top card of your library till end of turn. And then she would bounce back to your hand with the Time of Ice because she's tapped. And then you would replay Rona, exile Time of Ice with Rona, and just get the ball going again and keep your opponent off of creatures while you're drawing extra cards and just smashing them. Really cool engine, really mana and time intensive, but these were the type of things that you could put together in Dominaria to kind of outdo whatever your opponent was doing. And since aggro was not prevalent in this format, you often had enough time to do it as well. There are a few tilting cards worth mentioning here that people did not like in the format, and I'm sure some people would remove them from the format if they could. There was On Sarah's Wings, which is a 4-mana aura, which the enchanted creature would get +1/+1, lifelink, fly-in, and become legendary. And it was just very hard to race. Obviously, it's an aura, so it has some inherent risks. But if you slapped it on something super bulky or super resilient, you basically just made it impossible for your opponent to win the game. And unless they had removal right away, you were going to kill them in quick fashion. The other super salty card is the Cold Water Snapper, a 6-mana common 4/5 hexproof with no other abilities. Just a beefy, chunky hexproof creature that sits around, blocks all day, can't be removed by basically anything in the format, and there was On Sarah's Wings to throw on that Cold Water Snapper and just have this unbeatable Baneslayer with hexproof. There was also Arcane Flight, which was a blue mana for an aura, which gave an enchanted creature +1/+1, and flying, I believe. And unless you could deal with the enchantment directly, that just gave you a giant 5/6 hexproof flyer, and you could just win the game. Cold Water Snapper is responsible for a lot of salty finishes and a lot of people winning games. I'm glad they don't print too many creatures like that, or at least they have answers to those now, or they use alternatives to hexproof. And of course, we'd be remiss not to mention Icy Manipulator, which might be one of the most tilted limited cards of all time. This is not a particularly good card in Constructed, Cube, anything like that, but for limited, sometimes it just cuts your opponent off of mana, makes things really miserable. So yeah, Icy Manipulator, 2 big thumbs down for including that in this set. I do want to go ahead and close out the retrospective by putting a pin on kind of the power level of the set. It does not stack up particularly well to modern day Magic sets. Power creep is a real thing. Over the last 4 or 5 years since Dominaria came out, we have way more powerful cards. There are almost no cards in Dominaria that really see play, aside from maybe Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, which is actually one of the best planeswalkers of all time. But outside of that, there's just not that much that Dominaria has to offer. So it is really its own self-contained limited format. Now that Dominaria has rotated out of Standard, and it's been out of Standard for a little while, and you can only play it in formats where you also have access to the more powerful cards that have been printed today, you just don't see a lot of Dominaria cards in action. In fact, in our Jank Diver Gaming Cube, our unrestricted cube, which is the highest power level cube we have, our 450 cube only plays 7 cards from Dominaria. So out of 450 cards in the Arena card pool, we're only playing 7 from Dominaria, and 5 of those are check lands that might even get replaced by the Pain lands that are getting reprinted in Dominaria United. Outside of that, we have Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, and card number 7 from Dominaria, Dauntless Bodyguard, the one white 2/1 that can choose another creature and then sacrifice itself to give that creature indestructible. That's all we're playing from Dominaria. You know, there are plenty of options out there that are just outclassed these days. Goblin Chain Whirler, for how hard it is to cast, is just easily replaced by Rampage and Ferocidon and Bone Crusher Giant. Steel Leaf Champion is power crept out by Old Growth Troll. Benawish Marshal, which was one of the mainstays from Dominaria for a while. This is white for a 3/3 that gives all your other creatures +1/+1. There are just so many more powerful Anthem effects that give you value on top of pumping your board that we just don't even play that card anymore. Think like not Welcome in Vampire, but Wedding Invitation and things like that. So Dominaria is overall on the weaker side of power level, and if you go into this set trying to compare it to another modern day set, I think you're going to be disappointed. If you draft it as its own limited experience, I think there's a lot of fun offered there. As far as limited formats go, self-contained limited formats and draft formats, this is still definitely one of the GOATs. Everything is fairly balanced. It's not perfectly balanced. You know, aggro could have used a little bit of a bump. There's a lot of grindy engine stuff going on. But if that's your sort of thing, this is a set that I think is very appealing, very fun. It has a lot of replayability. You can put together these kind of multicolor piles with these historic effects and these cool rares that do splashy things that don't normally do anything, but because you have certain other cards and configurations of cards, they do certain things that normally they wouldn't. There's a lot of stuff like that going on in this set, and as its own limited set, it's very, very good. It just does not match up particularly well to the limited sets of modern day. So that's the retrospective on 2018 Dominaria. something that holds a fond spot in my heart. When I do look back at the best limited sets I've ever played, I do think Dominaria always comes to the forefront of my mind. I remember very specific interactions and, people I was playing with at the time. It was at a very crucial time in my life, too, where I was becoming more involved in the Magic scene and stuff like that, where I knew that I was a good player and I could impart that wisdom to other people who were just getting into the game. I met a lot of friends around that time. Dominaria definitely holds a good spot in my heart, but I could understand if someone who's never played the set sits down and plays it today and just thinks things are overall feeling kind of weak, especially compared to the modern day set. So that's where I stand with the set. I hope you'll give it a try, and if you have any opinions about it, whether you think it's overrated, it doesn't stand up, it hasn't held the test of time, let me know what you think, and we can chat about it. Let me know what your favorite sets are. I do want to do more retrospectives moving forward, especially on some of my favorite sets. And that's going to do it for today. So, as always, if you have any topics you want to hear on Scattered Thoughts, you have any feedback, feel free to message me below in the comments, find me at the social medias. I've got some Magic articles that I've been writing recently if you want to read into those. Whatever you guys want to hear, I'm here for it. That's going to bring this episode to a close. Remember, as always, we are a cube-related community here at Jank Diver Gaming, so if you want to get on some cube action through Arena, find us in the Discord links down below, and we can guide you to our signups for events on Wednesdays and Sunday nights. That's it. Thanks for hanging out and listening to me gush about Dominaria from 2018. It's a great set. It has a really long-lasting legacy, even if not everything has held up. That's going to do it for this episode of Scattered Thoughts. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I will catch you all next time.